Welcome to Back Away Slowly, where we walk through the mysterious places, explore ominous folktales, and seek out strange creatures to try to understand how they came to be, the effects they had on history and still have on culture. All sources, social links, and more are available at backawayslowlypodcast.com. A warning that serious themes and language are used, so viewer discretion is advised. I'm glad you decided to walk with me again down this spooky road at the best time of year. Last season was all about haunted locations, from a deadly lake to an alarmingly enormous cave, to a crumbling honky-tonk. This season, however, it's not where we're investigating, so much as what. The title of this first episode may have given it away, but this season is all about monsters. Monsters have maintained a firm foothold in the human psyche ever since there was a human psyche. And believe it or not, monsters do have a purpose. At their most basic, they can act as a boogeyman to make sure that children come home on time and stay out of dangerous areas. Or they can act as fireside entertainment. But honestly, monsters mean so much more than that. Some serve as explanations for sudden deaths, illnesses, or misfortune, particularly before germ theory. They could serve as cautionary tales about what humans yearn for, and that sometimes it's for the best that you don't get what you want. They can fill the gap in knowledge about animals we don't yet understand. Sometimes monsters are used by a political or religious power to keep the general populace in line by offering their own guidance as a safety net against the beasts lurking beyond the edge of town. And sometimes, monsters are the only way that people can understand the worst impulses and actions of their fellow man. All of this brings us to our first topic. Pretty much everyone who has graced a spooky online forum or poked around a creepy podcast or two has read or heard a scary story of someone stalked in the woods, or their property accosted by a mysterious, sometimes humanoid figure in the dark. It's definitely not Bigfoot, though it seems to have a high intelligence, as well as possessing incredible speed. You don't need to read the comments to know what will be repeated over and over. That's definitely a skinwalker or a Wendigo. Now, those of you who are online a lot are probably familiar with the term Wendigo, as interest in this creature has skyrocketed in the past decade, becoming a monster in TV shows, comics, video games, and movies. For those completely unfamiliar, don't worry, we'll get to it. I've listened to and read spooky internet stories for years, and I eventually grew to view this repeated comment with annoyance. It's clear that both the Skinwalker and Wendigo have become a knee-jerk suggestion, with almost no knowledge of either creature beyond the basics, and some of these basics are incorrect, the victim of internet word of mouth, so to speak. Hell, most don't realize that Skinwalkers and Wendigos are from two entirely separate areas of North America. I also heard a very loud silence, an absence of voices from the communities that these creatures originated from. I wanted to cover both, as they're both creatures that are significant to their cultures, and both are being forced to serve as internet story fodder. While I feel confident about the quantity and quality of research I have for the Wendigo, I don't feel like I have a suitable amount of information for the Skinwalker, so don't expect to hear about them later in this season. Considering the origin for the topic at hand, I want to give a disclaimer. I am not, at least to my knowledge, of Native American or First Nation descent. I've spent months poring over sources that utilize stories and context that come directly from Native people, academic papers from those who have spent years studying the topic. I've conversed with those in the community who were able to give me even more context. These episodes are me doing my best to find and share information from as many responsible sources as I can find, or even sources that aren't responsible, but to use them as examples. I'm in no way trying to speak for or personally represent these groups. All of my sources can be found on the main site, and if I missed some information, you can email me at backawayslowlypodcast@gmail.com. I will also be including a guide in the show notes for terms and names that may be unfamiliar to the casual listener. With all of this out of the way, let's walk down the brutal winters of the North to find the truth about the Wendigo. belief in and development of the Wendigo belongs to the Algonquian tribes of the northeastern portions of the United States and Canada. These tribes include the Cree Peoples, such as the Plains Cree, the Woods or Rock Cree, the Swampy Cree, and the Eastern Cree, the Ojibwe, the Saulteaux, the Delaware, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Illinois, Kickapoo, and many more. With so many tribes involved, the creature naturally goes by many names. A few of these include Witigo, Watika, Chenu, Kewok, and Windigo, spelled either with an E or an I, though the spelling with an I is more common in historical or academic papers. The more books I opened, the more apparent it became that the appearance of the Wendigo varies in about as many ways as there are tribes that fear it. We'll start with the description that has the most fantastic details, and run down the list to the most, for lack of a better word, mild version. But keep in mind that all of these iterations have one thing in common, one detail that's never forgotten. No matter how remarkable their form or where they reside, every Wendigo is constantly tormented by the pursuit and consumption of human flesh. And besides a few exceptions, they were all once human. The most monstrous form of the Wendigo include the Alberta Cree and Métis description of an owl-eyed monster with clawed hands, hair matted down a bare, emaciated back, and a heart made of solid ice. This is where we first encounter the common detail that the creature is so obsessed with the thought of food that it's eaten its own lips, teeth bared to the wind. Some Ojibwe, Montagnais, Naskapi, and Cree tribes believe the Wendigo is a horrifyingly enormous creature, its torso towering into the treetops, or even sometimes into the clouds. The floor quakes as it walks, the overwhelming stench of decay accompanying it wherever it goes. Its approach and passing causes shrieking, freezing winds to crack the trees apart. How did it get so large? Oh, well, with every human the Wendigo consumes, the more blood it drinks, it grows. Even more extreme than this, some versions in Ojibwe belief describe it as an icy skeleton. Sometimes it's rubbed tree pitch or resin all over itself so that bark and pine needles stick to it. Even more alarming, quote, some accounts say Wendigos have a huge, gaping mouth totally devoid of lips, are capable of exploding trees with hysterical exhalations, and can swim across glacial lakes in seconds. Essentially, that a gasp from this monster can shatter a tree. The Wendigo can make a loud, sinister hissing as the wind rattles through its jagged teeth. Sometimes these giant Wendigos utilize tools, such as a large staff. Sometimes it'll even use giant trees as snowshoes, covering vast distances quickly. We see the chilling description of superhuman speed in less fantastic versions of the Wendigo, but sometimes it's included with the giant Wendigo. Victor Barrow reported in his 1977 book, Wisconsin Chippewa Myths and Tales, the Wendigo is usually, but not always, endowed with powers, such as superhuman strength and stamina that allows it to stalk, overpower, and devour its victims. Wendigos are usually credited with exceptional eyesight, hearing, and sense of smell. They are said to move with the speed of the wind and have the ability to walk across deep snow or even open water without sinking. Imagine, you're out in the woods when, faster than the human eye can register, a towering icy skeleton appears before you. A blizzard catches up to its presence, the wind slamming into you. The trees that had previously seemed so sturdy begin to snap and crash down around you. The monster bares its teeth down at you, and you realize that you are its target. Well, I can certainly understand how the mere idea of such a creature has terrified so many people for centuries. Now we take a step down from giant to human-sized. This is the version where things can get complicated, as the human-sized Wendigo can vary greatly in its appearance. They can have the same ghostly, emaciated presentation as mentioned before, its skin stretched over bone. They can be dirty and ungroomed, their clothing ragged. Sometimes they're seen in the midst of eating their own lips or fingers. But its most alarming presentation is when they appear indistinguishable from other human beings, when they look like you, me, and everyone else. In this state, it's only their supernatural strength and obsession with consuming flesh that would give any indication of what they really are. And despite this casual appearance, a heart of ice dwells at its center. John Colombo states in his 1982 book Windigo, quote, "Yet violence is not necessarily a part of the Windigo temperament. As will be seen in an instance described later, people who are called Windigo may behave in a perfectly casual manner and go about the business of killing men as coolly as they would about killing animals." So while the first iteration of the Wendigo is undeniably a dangerous monster, this version can also act in ways that would disguise its true intentions. An interesting quality of becoming a Wendigo is that quite a few tribes make it clear that this condition doesn't discriminate. A woman can become a Wendigo just as easily as a man. Even beyond that, children, babies, and even dogs can suffer this condition, which makes me think about rabies when discussing vicious behavior in a dog, but I digress. Despite this being an equal opportunity condition, a male and female Wendigo wouldn't be in each other's company as a married pair, or even together at all. In general, if two Wendigos meet, it's a common belief that they'll fight, and the winner will consume the loser. Now, if you've walked through an arts fair or clicked around a few sites to learn about the Wendigo, you've no doubt seen a depiction of it with antlers on its head, or a deer skull on its head, or as its head. I have over a dozen sources, many containing numerous individual stories and descriptions. Counter to depictions in pop culture, I've only found one source, and it was only mentioned a single time within that source, where the description of a Wendigo includes having large ear protrusions, horns, or antlers. But how did such a big part of the Wendigo's visual identity in pop culture come to develop like this? We'll touch back on this a bit later. But how does one even become such a monster? They were once human, right? How did they become an emaciated skeleton stalking through the winter forests? Unfortunately, there are multiple ways to fall victim to this condition. The first is the most well-known and the most gruesome method, which is by consuming human flesh. This occurs due to starvation and desperation, but once the flesh has been consumed, it becomes an obsession that pushes the victim to continue beyond eating human meat to survive, warping it into the need to hunt down humans out of desire. Now, many cultures believe that the consumption of human flesh can grant supernatural powers. For this creature in particular, it's perhaps best described by Nathan Carlson in his paper Reviving Wetiko from 2009. Quote, "Cannibalism is thought to culminate in Wetiko by means similar to those of contagion. Like the flesh of any other animal, human flesh is believed to possess spirit power that is acquired through consumption of the tissue or organs. Cannibalism, in a sense, exacerbates the power already present in the human consumer, in effect multiplying them and causing them to expand out of control into an incipient Wetiko compulsion. The person turning Wendigo feels a terrible cold, a fierce hunger that no normal food can abate. No amount of warm blankets or hot drinks can chase away the chill, and food starts to smell foul. In desperation, they turn to the only thing that can even temporarily ease the bone-chilling cold and aching hunger: human meat. The second way to become a Wendigo is by being possessed by a Wendigo spirit. A vulnerable person could be targeted by the spirit of a Wendigo, which introduces a question. Is the Wendigo something that a human morphs into, or is it an external spirit that possesses a person? Well, the answer from my research and conversations with relevant parties is that it can be either one. It's mostly dependent on the circumstances of the particular Wendigo, as well as which tribe's beliefs are appropriate to the situation or area. The third way to become a Wendigo is through dreams. We'll discuss this more in depth later, as Wendigo dreams are a complex and culturally significant topic. However, the part that's relevant right now is that a person may be approached by a spirit in a dream, and potentially misled to consume human flesh within that dream, condemning them to the same fate in the real world. This particular method of becoming a Wendigo really helped me understand what an ever-present threat that this creature must have felt like, or potentially still is. Not only are there numerous ways that this can happen to you, but the same risks are present for every individual around you, possibly making your peers potential Wendigos. You're never truly safe, even in your sleep. Having this constant threat in the back of people's minds, on top of trying to survive in a harsh environment, must have made life incredibly challenging. The fourth way to, quote, go Wendigo, is through sorcery. There are a few ways by which a sorcerer practicing, quote, bad medicine may accomplish this. One is that they can send a Wendigo spirit to haunt a person's dreams, contributing to the third way one can go Wendigo. Another option utilized by the sorcerer is to manipulate the environment. Conjuring up heavy winds and snow, as well as driving away game, is a surefire way to create the conditions that would pressure someone to become a Wendigo. The last method of becoming a Wendigo can sometimes be tied to sorcery, as this fifth way is through isolation. Wendigos in Cree culture are sometimes called, quote, he who lives alone, or, quote, hermit Wendigo, in connection to this concept. You may be familiar with cabin fever. That's kind of how I imagine this to occur. But where does this tie into sorcery? Well, we mentioned that sorcerers can scare away game or create conditions that enforce isolation. If a sorcerer did cause these circumstances, what's to stop him from conjuring a Wendigo spirit and sending it to go keep you company? These extra conditions via sorcerer aren't required to create a Wendigo. Sometimes extended time alone in a challenging environment is enough all on its own. However the person got there, they're a Wendigo now. So what are some of the potential visual cues that could warn you that you're in the presence of a Wendigo? Quote, stupor, catatonia, depression, paranoia, anorexia, or the inability to hold down food, nausea and vomiting, emaciation, awry or glazed-looking eyes, swelling of the face, trunk, or limbs, and violence, and shouting, in some cases with unusual vocal sounds. The problem with this laundry list of symptoms is immediately evident. I've just recited some of the most common symptoms for nearly every illness known to man. So in the end, knowing the general list of symptoms offers no comfort. They just inform you that something is wrong. Well, now you're a flesh-eating monster, terrorizing your former family and friends. Is there no hope for you? Are you doomed to trudge through the snow of Northern America forever? Not quite. Believe it or not, there are a few options to cure a Wendigo. In order to cure a Wendigo, you have to get to the heart of the matter, literally. The priority for treatment is to melt, eject, or otherwise destroy the creature's icy heart. Historically, this was accomplished by having the victim drink hot water, tea, alcoholic beverages, tallow, which is beef fat, sturgeon oil, beaver fat, or bear grease in order to melt the ice. Meanwhile, the person is kept near a fire or boiling pots in order to further expose them to heat. Excessive sweating was a good sign that the treatment was working. Another, or additional option, is through a ceremony called Jesakid by the Ojibwe, or shaking tent. In a ceremonial lodge, which is composed of sapling trees bound into a dome-like structure for a single occupant, a conjurer would enter the lodge and summon spirits that could provide further information as well as guidance on the situation. While these communities do everything they can to cure someone suffering the Wendigo condition, this isn't always possible or successful. If the person's condition has advanced too far, they may need to be eliminated for the safety of the community. Howard Norman collected stories from 1969 to 1980, working together with the Swampy Cree elders to represent their stories accurately in his book, Where the Chill Came From. In this book, on the topic of what options they had when dealing with a Wendigo, it reads, quote, To banish a man considered by his village to have gone Wendigo would only mean, quote, "It will get worse and will come back for us." Sadly, there are multiple stories where someone knows that they are being consumed with the Wendigo condition, and they beg for death so as not to harm their loved ones. In many tribes, it's believed that only a conjurer or spiritual leader would be able to eliminate a Wendigo. Joseph Curtis was a hunter of the Mistassini tribe and described this in 1924. Quote, "When a person has eaten human flesh, he becomes a Wendigo, and through having such a powerful, quote, game as man, his soul spirit becomes so strong that other less powerful are afraid to attack him. So the conjurer has to find him by sorcery. He then tries to get the cannibal's spirit into his conjuring cabin by challenging it to a fight." In other tribes, a Wendigo was commonly dispatched with an axe, as it was believed that bullets couldn't kill a Wendigo. However, a few sources say that it's believed that only a silver bullet could kill a Wendigo. As a side note, this is the first hint that the Wendigo belief has been influenced by werewolf folklore, which we'll revisit. Once the Wendigo is killed, however, the job wasn't over. The body was either cremated, or in some cases, hot tea or water was poured into the open chest cavity of the executed Wendigo to be sure that the creature didn't come back to life. Sometimes the heart was thrown into a roaring fire. Fur trader George Nelson, who spent over 20 years amongst the Cree, diligently recording their culture, noted that he saw an entry in the Nelson House District Report of 1815, where axes were used to kill Wendigos because the creatures were, quote, unwilling to be killed by a gun. However, Nelson didn't think this was accurate. Quote, "More probably, as Nelson states, guns were considered unreliable, and the use of the axe was enjoined both to kill the incipient Wendigo and to inflict corporeal damage that would prevent subsequent resurrection after the nominal death. Cremation of the body was intended to serve the same preventative function, particularly by melting the Wendigo's supposed heart of ice. Corpses of slain Wendigos were also sometimes shackled with trap chains, beheaded, or subjected to other mutilations that expressed the fears of the executioners that the diseased might become reanimated." So the belief in the Wendigo was widespread in the northeastern area of North America, and it was a part of life and storytelling for centuries amongst the Algonquian people. However, these tribes wouldn't remain alone forever, and the new settlers had a brand new monster to learn about. A few papers claim to contain the earliest reports of the Wendigo recorded by settlers, but the earliest mention that I could find was from the Montpellier in the 1630s. Now that was the first record mentioning a potential Wendigo, but the first full written statement I could find was from 1661 by Father Paul Lejeune in the Lake St. John area of Quebec. A group of men was dispatched to some tribes of the North Sea area, but news came that these men had met their death in, quote, a very strange manner. Father Paul wrote, quote, "Those poor men, according to the report given us, were seized with an ailment unknown to us, but not very unusual among the people we were seeking. They are afflicted with neither lunacy, hypochondria, nor frenzy, but have a combination of all these species of disease, which affects their imaginations and causes them more than canine hunger. This makes them so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men, like veritable werewolves, and devour them voraciously, without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking fresh prey, and the more greedily the more they eat. This ailment attacked our deputies, and, as death is the sole rarity among those simple people for checking such acts of murder, they were slain in order to stay the course of their madness." The first explicit use of the word Wendigo from the Cree in reference to transformed humans was in 1772 at Fort Severn, where a famine cannibal became, quote, violently insane, and was executed by his family, who feared that he would reanimate as a cannibal spirit, or Wittik. In the early 1800s, a record about the Lake Winnipeg Saulteaux tribe mentions giants that lived around the North Pole. This report states that these giants occasionally, quote, delegate their power to the Indians occasionally, unquote, which results in cannibalism. To me, this sounds like this attempted gift of power ends up inevitably overwhelming a human being. In early 1896, Anglican Bishop Richard Young of the Athabasca district wrote this letter journal to the Church Missionary Society. Quote, "The Indians have a great terror of these so-called Wendigos, or cannibals. They believe that after eating human flesh, their heart becomes a lump of ice and no one alive is safe from them. Absurd as all this sounds to us, it is a real terror to the untutored Indian." In 1823, fur trader George Nelson wrote in a letter journal at the Lac La Ronge trade post in Saskatchewan, quote, "There is a kind of disease, or distemper rather, and of the mind, I am fully persuaded, peculiar to Crees and Saulteaux, and of which they have the greatest dread and horror, and certainly not without the very greatest cause, the consequences 49 times out of 50 being death. They term this Wendigo." These stories continue to trickle in from the fur traders and missionaries as they had more contact with native tribes. Eventually, anthropologists set out to record these tales of human-turned monster. One of these was anthropologist Frank G. Speck, born in 1881 and died in 1950, who recorded the lifestyles and folkways of the Montagnais-Naskapi Indians of northern Quebec during annual field trips. One of the more chilling statements he recorded was from Them Kakwa of Lake St. John in 1919. He said, quote, "It is a belief from the ancient times that they, the cannibals, appear just like the Indians. In the summer he lives like other people and eats the same food, but he changes his food completely in the winter, for he changes, and he eats people then." Catholic missionary Roger Vandersteen wrote to his experiences with the Wabasca Cree at Trout Lake in Alberta, Canada. These were recorded in his book, Some Woodland Cree Traditions and Legends, published in 1960. Quote, "This is the portrait of a Wendigo, wild and haggard, barefoot, tall and thin, ragged, sometimes completely naked. Usually the face is mutilated, and the most frequent mutilation is the lips. These have been gnawed by mice or other parasites so that the teeth show menacingly. He wanders in the forest in search of prey. A constant thirst torments him, and only human blood can quench it and warm his heart, for his heart is a block of ice contained within a frozen thoracic cage. He kills his victims in order to suck the still warm blood. Then he is satisfied. Sometimes he eats the flesh of children." We've discussed what the Wendigo looks like, how it comes to be, what it eats, how it can be cured, and how settlers were first introduced to it. Now we're going to hear a few of the stories that were told within various tribes about the creature. This will give us context into how it was discussed amongst members of the tribe. Frequently, these stories were told as announced performances, told by storytellers as an active narrator-audience activity. A good number of these stories were collected by anthropologists, such as John Cooper, Regina Flannery, and Howard Norman, who spent significant amounts of time with these communities and collaborated with native elders to be sure of the translations. However, these are from a variety of tribes, so keep in mind that these stories, memories, and the events within them, such as how the Wendigo is defeated, vary a good deal. I also find it worth noting that in Victor Barnau's book, Wisconsin Chippewa Myths and Tales, that native informants were careful to distinguish, quote, true stories of their own or a relative's experience versus a Tebatamawin story. Tebatamawin are stories of, quote, long ago, to the point where the exact location of the story's setting or the people involved is unclear. And so we enter the first category of Wendigo stories, those involving dreams. A member of the Lac La Ronge Cree recounted one of his own dreams where he was under threat of becoming a Wendigo. This tribe member is invited by the North Spirit to partake of a feast of ducks. However, when he sits down, a stranger touches his elbow and says, quote, "Eat not thou of that. Look into thy dish." When this man takes another look, he realizes that the duck wing he'd taken a hold of was actually the arm of a child. Our narrator exclaims, What a narrow escape. The stranger takes him to another room to give him the most delicious-looking meat he'd ever seen. Despite this, he knows something's wrong and he wouldn't eat. As he thought, it's revealed that all of this meat was the flesh of, quote, Indians served up to him. The stranger takes him to a third room and offers him tongues. He also doesn't eat these, now knowing what they really are. The stranger exclaims, quote, "Why refusest thou what I offer thee? Is it not good?" The narrator calmly dismisses this accusation, saying he simply isn't hungry. The stranger takes him to a fourth room, which is full of hearts. Once again, the narrator doesn't eat any of this. The stranger looks at him and finally says, quote, "It is well done. Thou hast done well." The narrator wakes, knowing that if he'd eaten any of this food within the dream, he would have been doomed to become a cannibal himself. Quote, "Those who eat at these feasts are frequently, but not universally told thus, 'This is a sign to thee that one day thou shalt become a cannibal, and feed on the flesh of thy fellows. When thou shalt see children play with and eat ice or snow in thy tent, say, My time is near, for then thou shalt soon eat Indian human flesh.'" In our next story, a young native, quote, "a few years back," note that this story was recorded in 1823, was experiencing Windigo dreams. These dreams became so frequent that he began to beg his friends to kill him before he became one. His family and friends were all greatly depressed, as before this he'd always been a very peaceful member of the community, but they knew what had to be done. His brother tried to lay a trap for him, but the young man knew the trap had been laid. He called out to his brother, warning him that no matter what they did to his body, they must destroy his heart. Abandoning all guise of trap or trickery, other men joined the brother who made the first blow. The brother shot for the heart and the young man dropped. But he was back on his feet almost instantly, continuing towards the nearby camp. When he rose, they saw that the ball had gone straight through him, but not a drop of blood had spilled. His brother's own heart sank as he realized that his sibling's heart had already frozen into ice. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, the group descended on the Wendigo with ice chisels and axes. To honor the young man's desire, they collected a large pile of dry wood and laid him on it. His body was consumed, but his heart remained perfect and whole, rolling off of the pile several times. After placing it back on the fire repeatedly, they used their ice chisels to hack the heart to bits, throwing the pieces onto the fire, where it was finally destroyed. A Wendigo had been terrorizing the people around Black Fly Lake. Hunter Moak was out with 2 hunters when they heard a flock of crows talking in the distance. But something was wrong. Moak realized that the crows themselves weren't getting any closer, only the noise was. The sounds of flapping wings and screaming swooped down on the men. Moak realized that this was the work of a Wendigo. Moak himself conjured the distant crows into a sack, but as silence descended, they realized that one of the hunters had disappeared. Moak knew that the hunter had been taken in the confusion and had already been eaten. It was left to poor Moak to deliver the news to his family. Not long after, another hunter left the village with his canoe, heading towards the frozen river. Concerned, a number of villagers followed him. At the frozen river, the hunter placed his canoe on the ice and climbed inside. He began to paddle furiously at the ice. After a little while, he shouted, "I still have a long way to go." After more paddling, he burst into tears, crying, "I can't turn around. I can't make it back to the village." After he fell asleep, the villagers bundled him up and took him back home. When the hunter woke at home, he said, quote, "Each time I portaged, I saw the Windigo. The Windigo was following me. He was trying to kill me. He's out there now. I couldn't rest. I had to keep paddling. I knew the Windigo was after me. I'm happy you could save me." The next morning, the man was gone. They found his canoe on the frozen river, slowly spinning in the wind. After this incident, no one would leave the village for fear of falling prey to the Wendigo. However, this suited the Wendigo's purposes just fine. If no one was leaving the village, then there was no one to bring back game. The Wendigo was starving them out. Moak used the village's last caribou shoulder blade to summon some tallow. He had everyone drink this tallow, reasoning that if the Wendigo grew every time he consumed someone, then by drinking this tallow, they would make the Wendigo smaller. Eventually, crows arrived, carrying the news that the Wendigo was dead. Its heart melted. I find this story interesting because it implies that the Wendigo itself has some control over animals, or it has some kind of conjuring abilities itself. This is one of the only stories where I've encountered this. It definitely makes this creature more plotting human and less mindless monster. The story also follows a common pattern where native tales have abrupt endings that aren't fully explained to the casual viewer. I'm unsure of how the villagers drinking tallow would affect a distant Wendigo, but this could imply that the Wendigo has a connection to the physical bodies of the villagers. Since I don't see this more often, it's impossible to tell. In the following stories, we'll see another method for dealing with the Wendigo: becoming a Wendigo in order to fight off a Wendigo. We'll start with a very brief story from Wisconsin. A Wendigo was accosting a village, and everyone was terrified, except for a young boy. The boy asked a healer to change him into a Wendigo, but to also prepare a remedy to cure his condition after the fight. Once transformed, the Wendigo boy fought with the enemy Wendigo, eventually killing it. Immediately after, the healer poured boiling tallow into the boy, quote, melting the bad Wendigo spirit out of him. An old medicine man noticed that the kettles in the village had started to rattle. The medicine man didn't dismiss this, for he knew that this was a sign that a Wendigo was nearby. He summoned the villagers, filled a pipe with tobacco, and asked each person to smoke it. Quote, the one who could puff on the pipe 4 times and light it without using a match would have the power to kill a Wendigo. One young boy was successful, and he wasted no time instructing the villagers to arrange a place where he could fight the Wendigo, as well as to boil a pot of tallow. The medicine man told the boy that this Wendigo would be in the company of 3 dogs. When the boy readied himself to fight the Wendigo, 2 dogs came to his side from nowhere. The boy declared that he'd be able to predict how his own fight would go, judging on how the dogs fought each other. While the story doesn't mention how, the boy turns himself into a Wendigo and engages in combat with the enemy Wendigo, who's specifically described as being a giant. The boy won this fight, and the villagers poured the hot tallow into him, melting, quote, the bad spirit out of him. One morning, the kettle over the fire started to shake, and the villagers eyed each other nervously. They knew what this meant. A Wendigo was near. As a side note, this is the second time that it's been mentioned that kettles rattling act as a warning alarm for an approaching Wendigo. I'm unsure if there's any cultural significance to the kettle or its connections to the Wendigo, but if anyone out there knows, I'd love to hear it. The villagers went from door to door, seeking someone strong enough to fight the Wendigo. They came upon the dwelling of an old woman living with her granddaughter. When the little girl asked the old woman what was wrong, the grandmother replied in no uncertain terms, quote, someone is coming and we're all going to die. Upon hearing this, the little girl approached some villagers and asked them to bring her a couple of sticks of sumac that were as long as her arm, with the bark peeled off. Sumac is a fruiting plant that has numerous uses in the native community, quote, such as healing burns, blisters, and sores. This makes it an appropriate life symbol to counter the cold death symbolism of the Wendigo. They gave her the sticks, and she took them home. The air outside turned so cold that the trees began to crack. The little girl turned to her grandmother and asked her to put a kettle of tallow over the fire. As the night wore on, the air grew colder and colder. Finally, a Wendigo stepped out of the darkness of the trees, as tall as a tree himself, and as he walked, the nearby lake froze over. The girl had 2 dogs with her, the Wendigo had 1. Her dogs killed his dog. As the dogs fought, the girl grew larger and larger. Her sumac rod had turned to copper, which she used to strike down the Wendigo. She struck him again, killing him. She then turned to the kettle, shrinking smaller and smaller as she drank the tallow. Meanwhile, the villagers were chopping up the giant Wendigo's body. In this story, the entire body was ice except for the center, where the original man lay. This is another story where the combat of dogs serve as a kind of premonition for the fight to come. I haven't been able to find out why this is, but I'd love to know. This next collection of stories is interesting, because the Wendigo of these narratives isn't a giant, but instead resembles a normal man, plotting to kill as a human murderer would. This story comes from Attawapiskat in northern Ontario, reported by Arthur Edrington in 1935. One winter, a traveling old man stumbled upon his own son-in-law, his 30-year-old daughter, and their baby. The old man joined them in their wigwam for the winter. One day, the son-in-law was gone, and the old man played with his grandson. He thought, quote, "Oh, he is fat, and will make a good meal for me." The son-in-law returned with some caribou meat. While they were all eating dinner, the man said, "Bring my grandson. I will feed him off my panusk," which is a roasting stick. While he was feeding the boy, the old man began to make sounds that mimicked the sound of choking. He exclaimed that his grandson was choking, so the mother stood to take her child. Ignoring her, the man ran out of the tent to continue caring for his grandchild. Outside, he truly choked the child to death. The old man pretended to weep, supposedly devastated by the tragic loss of his grandchild. Sometime later in the night, the couple had grieved together with the old man. He said, quote, "You better go off. I will come along later after I put away the body." While they were gone, he took the next gruesome step by roasting the baby over the fire. He decided to put a beaver over the fire as well, intending to compare the taste of both. He concluded that the beaver was too tough, but his grandson's flesh, that was just right. Unfortunately, there's no happy ending or justice to this story. The old man was never caught, as he always seemed to be one step ahead of pursuit. As well, because of how a number of these tribes function from season to season, it meant that he could shelter with an unaware family in the winter, and then slip in with another family for the next. Our next story sees a group of hunters following some hare tracks through the snow. Mickey Simoska, translated to "he always barks," moved ahead of the rest when the hare tracks swallowed him. Fortunately, author Howard Norman included notes in the beginning of his book where the chill came from, so I was able to find out what exactly the hare tracks swallowed him meant. In this case, the note references what's called, quote, swallowing places, otherwise known as sump holes. Sump holes are weak spots in the ice or snow where people can fall through, well known to the Cree as places of death. One of the people that Norman interviewed was Hoyt Backward Owl, who mentioned that his brother tragically lost 4 sons to sump holes. Back in the story, the hunters ran up to where their friend had disappeared and looked into the sump hole. They saw that rabbit tracks led into and back out of the sump hole. They also felt air coming out of the snowy ground, smelling of something burning. Unable to find their friend and with nothing else they could do, they returned to the village. That night, a strange man appeared in the village. He proclaimed, "It will bring bad luck, no follow hare tracks. For the next few days, don't follow them." The village dogs circled him as he spoke, smelling his feet, and even the people around him noticed he smelled of something burning. The man left, but the dogs began to act up. They snapped and snarled at the cooking fires, tearing apart any pair of shoes they could find. The next day, a group of hunters followed some moose tracks. When one of the hunters pulled ahead, they were swallowed by the moose tracks. Again, with the man gone and nothing to be done, the hunters returned home. But as they walked into the village, they noticed that the strange man was back. He said, "Do not hunt moose. It's dangerous," leaving immediately after. In hindsight, the Wendigo seemed to be laying seeds of fear, slowly forbidding hunting of any kind. This, naturally, would create the perfect circumstance to create weakened prey, or even more Wendigos. But the villagers were now more than a little suspicious. One villager asked, "Where does this man who warns us too late go after he warns us?" Another answered, "He lives off by himself. I saw him go into a cave." Heartbroken, angry, and desperate for answers, the hunters set out to find the man's home. They came upon the cave, icicles hanging over the entrance. The cave inside was covered in moss, carpeted with the bones and clothes of their fallen companions. The hunters built a fire in the cave, filling it with smoke. This task done, the men hid outside of the cave and summoned a weasel. This story utilizes an animal other than a dog, starting to hint at the relationship between man and nature at large in Algonquian culture. The Wendigo entered the cave and was blinded by the smoke. Taking advantage of the distraction, quote, "The weasel crawled down the Wendigo's throat and chewed the Wendigo's heart." The weasel also took some of the clothes from the deceased hunters for its own nest as payment for its services. This story is from the Sandy Lake Cree in 1971. A medicine man named Dark Sky had several wives, but his eyes still strayed to another young woman, becoming infatuated with her from afar. Dark Sky approached the woman's father, asking if he could take her as his wife. The father wasn't impressed. Quote, "You have too many wives now, Dark Sky. I refuse your request." Hatred burned within Dark Sky, and he moved his wives and children a short distance away, but he plotted his revenge. After their lodges were constructed, Dark Sky dug a hole in the cinders of the fire, placed a ball of snow inside, and then covered it with ashes. He sat before the embers of the fire, singing for several hours, as his extended family looked on in confusion. He eventually fell silent. After a moment, he dug up the snow, which had turned into a ring of ice. As he lifted that ring of ice to his forehead, the freezing north wind slammed into the lodge wall, the wind carrying the screams and howls of people. Dark Sky smiled grimly, knowing that he'd been successful. He'd turned the young woman into a Wendigo, and the screams on the wind were those of her family that she'd unknowingly devoured. A few days later, Dark Sky returned to the old village. He found destroyed lodges and half-eaten corpses, but he also found the Wendigo woman. Because this had been through his own creation, he now had power over this creature. He brought her back to camp, putting her in a tent with heated rocks. The ice melted out of her body and hair, returning her to normalcy, but she remembered nothing of her past. She became Dark Sky's favorite woman, but she was never accepted by the other wives. They knew what had transpired, and they kept their children as far from her as possible. Lonely and confused, the young woman asked Dark Sky about her own family and where she'd come from. At first, he deflected these inquiries, but after a while, he saw no harm in telling her. So he told her everything. As it turns out, there was great harm in dropping all of this on her. She was heartbroken, depressed, ashamed, and defeated. When her behavior took this turn, she lost the favor of Dark Sky. She was now trapped within this extended family, but excluded by all. And it was alone that she began to feel cold. Chills ran through her at night. She knew what this was now. She knew that this was the Wendigo spirit fighting to take possession of her again. She knew that once she had turned, she'd be used to get revenge on Dark Sky. Despite this perhaps being appealing to some, to her it meant that her body would again be used against her will. Every day, more ice formed within her. Her body began to yearn for human flesh. Unable to stand this any longer and unwilling to harm the innocent members of her new, albeit distant, extended family, she used a knife to kill herself. It seems that it's not a unique narrative to any culture, that of a woman being pursued against her will, manipulated and trapped. Hell, the only name that this story gives to anyone is that of Dark Sky. The villain gets a name, an identity, but his victim doesn't. Despite being allowed no agency over her body or life, she's still expected, within this story, to protect others and to save them from a man's mistake. The poor girl's crime was existing, and for that she died alone. Our last story focuses on themes of community, as it's teamwork and cooperation that saves the day. A large group of people gathered to find safety from a Wendigo. When they realized that they weren't able to escape him, they knew that their only chance was to set a trap, but they looked uneasily at each other, knowing that this required someone to be bait. An elderly woman stepped forward, volunteering to be the sacrifice for the good of the community. Everyone was deeply touched by her sacrifice and wished it wasn't necessary, but they had no alternative and they were running out of time. The woman sat down in the trap. The Wendigo approached, its head as tall as the trees, the ground shaking beneath its feet. As he neared, no doubt suspicious, the woman called out that she'd been abandoned by her people, who'd fled from the Wendigo's approach. The Wendigo stepped into the trap, where the woman set off rigged weights, dropping a heavy beam across the Wendigo's back. The Wendigo's bellow was the signal for the rest of the community to leap upon him with axes and chisels. These stories are small windows into the way of life of these tribes, and I wanted to know more about how, and above all else, why these Wendigo stories developed. How did these stories change when settlers came into the picture? What role does pop culture play in the story of this creature? These are all very big questions, so we'll start with understanding cultural contexts, possibly how the creature came to be, and why it is so important. Across many sources, I found that Ojibwe and Cree tribes were studied the most. That being said, what we'll discuss isn't necessarily word for word accurate about the numerous other tribes that have Wendigo folklore. Keep in mind that the sources that I have for this next section are specifically about Ojibwe and Cree life. Let's take a closer look at what life was like in the temperamental north. Not much could be consistently grown, so these groups had to rely on hunting. Hunting in and of itself could be unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. You weren't the only thing competing to bring down game, and all creatures, animal and human alike, were at the mercy of the unpredictable weather. Famine was a constant threat, starvation a very real possibility. This would be on the minds of hunters constantly, influencing how they approached every new day. Job Walks, a Cree hunter, explains this best, quote, "When it gets very hard, there is much to worry about. Where will the food come from? When many days go by in which no food is killed, the hunters have to get together to decide what to do. We may be gone many days, and we wouldn't know what the situation was at home. Back there, what is being eaten? What luck is there?" That worry goes out with you hunting at times. Sometimes you can use this worry to hunt better, but sometimes it makes things worse. But if too many large native groups stayed together for too long, the dietary needs of the group would demand the hunters to bring in more game. If they brought in too much game, it could deplete the numbers of prey animals too far, potentially making said game more and more scarce. To counteract this, the winters were spent in small groups. These could consist of a single family, or up to 3 families banding together to share resources. They depended on each other greatly, and if tasks weren't completed or were incorrectly done, the consequences could be devastating. These conditions led to a very tightly wound social dynamic. Author Colombo noted that, quote, "Practically all reports of those who have observed the Indians of northern Canada was a powerful pattern of emotional restraint and inhibition. There was almost a ban on any overt show of feeling. Silent fortitude in the face of hardship and even torture was highly valued. In interpersonal relationships, expressions of joy and anger were withheld. Great self-discipline was practiced and constantly exercised." Now, I want to make it clear that this doesn't mean that these cultural groups were emotionless, without love or joy, or didn't feel emotion strongly. What this describes to me is a situation with incredibly high stakes all the time. every day, every decision held potentially catastrophic consequences. In this setting, emotions getting in the way of decision-making was dangerous. But emotions can't be contained forever, and this created an atmosphere of stress and anxiety that ran just under the surface. Interviews with hunters revealed a life where a large portion was spent in solitude, quote, driven by the need for food and the fear of failure. Colombo goes on to write, quote, he saw himself as being in constant combat with supernatural forces, aided only by his spirit helper. From early childhood, he was diligently prepared for his lot as a long hunter. He was trained to starve and to rely on assistance and companionship on no one but his spirit helper. His was truly a path of loneliness, formalized and intensified by tradition. So we now see that spiritual beliefs are a massive component of feeling like you have some support, something on your side against the forces of nature. But these routines did change depending on the time of year. For example, in the summer when animal pelts, furs, meat, and fat were depleted, these family units would come together as a large band gathering near a sizable body of water. They could then fish, socialize, and support each other. Groups in southern areas of the region would collect berries and rice. When they gathered like this, games would be played, one of which had familiar elements. A favorite game among the children was called the Windigo, or the cannibal game. One of the older boys would be selected to be the Windigo. This decision would be from each boy choosing a stick, the longest of which would then be the Windigo. He'd stick leaves into his hair or otherwise on his head to try to manufacture the appearance of a monster before hiding in a clump of bushes. The other kids would form a line, each holding the belt of the child in front of them. One of the older boys would lead the group, carrying a club. They all moved forwards in a line towards the bushes, and when they came near, the Windigo child would leap from the bushes, screaming wildly. The chosen leader would engage the Windigo in combat as the children behind him shrieked and clung together, and sometimes the Windigo would seize a child and pretend to eat it. So from this, we see that starvation is already on the minds of the adults. However, even as children, the creature that's the manifestation of starvation is already a well-known character in their lives. When these large gatherings took place, it was an opportunity to support each other, but it was also a risk. This drastic switch between complete isolation to large crowds had subtle yet notable effects. Conflicts could occur, stew during isolation, and then be revived again at the next gathering. There was always a fear of what the swampy Cree called, quote, bad conjurers. Simple insults or misunderstandings were feared to trigger a conjurer among them to deplete prey animal populations, increase sickness, cause stillbirths, and in general end in numerous deaths. The book Windigo from 1982 reads, quote, this change from isolation to gathering created adjustment problems which were not readily solved and which gave rise to suspicions of almost paranoid proportions. A tense feeling of being crowded and closed in was common. Individualization was carried to an extreme in this process since sorcery could emanate from anyone, including one's own relatives. The only defense was strengthening and augmenting one's own powers to stand alone. So these gatherings were a time of cooperation, play, and support, but it also brought flame closer to a powder keg. When I look at this perspective, I can't help but wonder if the Windigo creature is a way to warn against becoming too individualized. And from a few of the stories we heard, a Windigo presents an opportunity to band together as a community, to defeat a great threat together. Maybe the threat of a Windigo reminds the stressed members of these communities that you can't and shouldn't do everything alone. I think now would be a good time to discuss some of the basics of how the Ojibwe view the world around them. This will be an extremely brief crash course on elements of the Ojibwe spirituality, which will help us contextualize the Windigo. Please keep in mind that the spiritual beliefs of the Ojibwe are far more reaching, are incredibly intricate, and there are numerous differences between various Algonquian tribes. For this next portion, we'll be heavily referencing two papers by Professor Brady DeSanti of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. His 2 papers, Classroom Cannibal and The Cannibal Talking Head, discuss how he teaches students about the spiritual beliefs of the Ojibwe and the Wendigo within pop culture. In the Ojibwe viewpoint, human people are not the only people in the world. As DeSanti describes, quote, "The trees, plants, waters, stars, clouds, animals, and the sundry other components of the natural world are understood as different types of people, who possess some attributes common to humans, but display rich assemblages of talents and capacities that highlight their uniqueness too. There are human persons and non-human persons, such as animals, plants, and other natural elements that have their own agency, intelligence, and place in the world. DeSanti stresses to his students that these are best to be viewed as non-human persons. They aren't gods and aren't worshipped as such. They're cohabitants of the world, all playing an essential part in the spiritual ecosystem. All persons of any kind are actively trying to maintain balance in the universe. This is called Mino Bimadezawen, the concept of which translates to, quote, "live a good life." This equates to humans treating each other well, treating animals as relatives, and treating other spiritual forces with respect. For example, there's a belief that animals allow a certain number of themselves to be hunted by man, accepting the need that some of them must be killed so that man may live. Job Walks from Howard Norman's book describes the balance between hunters and prey. Quote, "It's an old agreement, the animals giving themselves up. We hunt them, we try not to insult them. Even in the hardest winters I can recall, some animals would see we need them and give themselves up." Remember a little bit ago I mentioned that if too many large groups stayed together for too long, that the dietary needs of the group would demand the hunters to bring in more game, then depleting resources too far? Because of this, the winters were spent in small groups. This is true, but these groups also practiced a routine that was pivotal to maintaining appropriate numbers of prey animals. They cycled hunting territories. It's believed that as part of the reciprocity of the animal's sacrifice, quote, Cree hunters try to let their hunting territories rest for 2 consecutive winters, allowing animal populations to replenish. This is just one example of how the native peoples worked to maintain balance with the natural groups and non-human persons of the world. Make sense? Okay, so the Ojibwe believe that a human is made up of 2 souls within one physical body. One of these souls is called the ego soul, responsible for intellectual and rational thought, memories, ideas, and skills. The other soul is the dream soul, responsible for creativity, instinct, and able to access the spiritual world. In an interesting turn, opposite of how we think of the head and heart, the more intellectual ego soul resides in the heart, while the dream soul is in the head. Now, living a balanced life includes the balance of these 2 souls within a person, using each soul's skills at the appropriate times. Failure to do so could lead to Wendigo behavior. DeSanti gives us an example. Quote, "The fact that the Wendigo chews and mutilates its own lips out of desperate hunger and has a heart of ice indicates an imbalance to the ego soul. An individual may be toxically consumed with personal issues at the expense of their family and community. The fact that the Wendigo is said to often reside alone and avoid human contact unless it's stalking them as prey further establishes an unhealthy preoccupation with the self." Let's look at another example, the Wendigo's heart of ice. DeSanti reasons, quote, "Given that the ego soul is believed to reside in a person's heart, the Wendigo can be seen as indicating that a person's ego is in disproportion to the rest of their nature. The icy heart demonstrates self-absorption and an estrangement from the human community to which that person belongs. The Wendigo's solitary tendencies to travel alone implies that, quote, "the individual has lost all sense of obligation and concern towards their community and is an outcast." Getting more into the weeds, think back to when we mentioned that animals will offer a certain number of themselves up to aid the human race. Well, there are quite a few cases where a Wendigo actively shirks acceptable human food in the pursuit of human flesh. This rejection of normal food is turning against this ultimate sacrifice and balance, causing an imbalance to the dream soul. Speaking of dreams, as promised, we'll now come to where we'll explain what exactly Wendigo dreams are. Dreams are extremely important in numerous native cultures. The concept of dreaming within Cree culture is called pawamiwin, translating to dreaming. In Ojibwe and Cree cultures, the ability to dream and to remember those dreams was strongly encouraged to young children. Dreams can contain valuable information about where game animals can be found, information about themselves and the risks they face, as well as help them discover their spirit helper. According to Robert Brightman in his 1988 paper, The Windigo in the Material World, quote, among Ojibwas and Crees west of James Bay, this relationship was purposefully cultivated by males and some females during an isolated vision fast at puberty. Among Eastern Cree, Montagnais, and Naskapi groups, the experience developed from cultivated or uninduced dreams and visions without a formal ritual of fasting in isolation. In the event that the individual wittingly or unwittingly established and perpetuated such a relationship with spirit beings associated with cannibalism, that individual's subsequent degeneration into a Wendigo was prefigured. In other words, if you associated with spirits or elements in a dream that were related to a Wendigo, it was believed that you were going to become a Wendigo. This is particularly tricky when you take a closer look at how dreams are understood within Algonquian communities. Beings, events, and objects within dreams are understood to be symbolic. The actions taken by an individual within a dream could have a significance that wouldn't be understood or come to pass until years later. Point being, the meaning of a dream or what it's foretelling aren't necessarily extremely clear or written in stone. The interpretation of those dreams is an art even of itself. Remember back to the first Wendigo dream story we discussed. The man given the option of duck wings, tongues, and hearts. DeSanti suggests in his paper Classroom Cannibal that this could be the effect of the dreamer having committed a transgression or lack of respect towards the spirit overseer of an animal species. Much like an angry neighbor, these spirit overseers or representatives of an animal species could knock on the mental door in an attempt to straighten you out for transgressions. But this offended overseer could potentially do far worse, such as withhold game animals from a community or the individual's family, until the perceived slight is rectified. So you're treading carefully in both your waking and sleeping life. The actions you take in both could spell doom for yourself or your family. It could turn you into a monster that would kill your family. Although spirits making contact within dreams could give valuable, life-saving information, it's hard to ignore that this proverbial thin ice creates high and consistent anxiety. Brightman states, quote, from this point of view, the Wendigo disorder was an act of fatalism. The sources suggest that some Algonquians contemplated or committed cannibalism because they believed that the act was, for them, necessary, inevitable, and predestined. For some, it was as though the act had already occurred through the medium of sorcery and dreams. As mentioned before, famine was never very far away, so let's take a look at famine cannibalism within the life of Algonquian tribes. Brightman mentions that, quote, the flesh of animals is understood by some rock Crees to transmit to persons who eat it under appropriate circumstances desired attributes of the species at hand. Thus, for example, raw moose blood is said to impart to the human hunter a kind of invisibility relative to the receptions of game animals, structurally a metaphoric likeness to the stealth and elusiveness of a moose. Human flesh was excessively powerful in its spiritual potency, resulting in the Wendigo's ability physically and spiritually to overcome and eat human prey. Spiritual abilities aside, Sean Aldag argues in Wendigo Psychosis and Psychiatric Perspectives of Cannibalism that, quote, the Wendigo's insatiable appetite mirrors the desperation that emerges amidst scarcity, while its transformation from human to monstrous entity signifies the risk of losing one's own humanity in dire situations. Ironically, the consumption of human flesh has made you feel even less human than you have ever been. The paper Windigo accounts from the James Bay Cree makes a significant observation that in many stories of famine cannibalism, these individuals did whatever they could to avoid it. They'd eat whatever organic material they had on hand, be it hides, clothing, bark, mosses, and tragically even prized hunting dogs. Even human or animal excrement wasn't too taboo in order to avoid this fate. Famine cannibalism was by no means the easy way out. This was the last resort. There are a few stories and reports of those who commit famine cannibalism hallucinating or claiming that the human flesh they see belongs to that of an animal. Colombo writes, quote, "The sufferer realizes that it is horrible to eat human beings, and the conflict between the desire to do so and the repugnance at the idea gradually resolves itself in the delusion that people look like beavers, and therefore the eating of them is not cannibalism." Famine cannibalism is an act of fatalism. It's knowing what you'll become, but having no other choice in order to survive. This takes an enormous mental toll, the victims of which show symptoms like that of any other severe trauma, i.e. dissociation, anxiety, and depression. Those forced to this action become consumed with guilt, disgust, and shame. They may move to isolate themselves from others, and potentially for others to avoid them, creating a terrible cycle of isolation. This is where the Wendigo stories come in. These stories remind communities of the importance of community, that working together and supporting each other is paramount. The Wendigo cautionary tale can be invaluable in preventing such a horrible situation as famine cannibalism. And from Steve Pitt's 2012 article, Windigo, if you're selfish enough to withhold food and mutual aid in times of stress, you are a monster. Okay, the worst has happened. You've had to do the unthinkable. But now what? How does your tribe react to famine cannibalism itself? Brightman writes, quote, "Factors influencing whether famine cannibals were ostracized, killed, or readmitted to society necessarily included their prior social position, but must also have been decisively influenced by their behavior. Since aversion to conventional foods seems everywhere to have been a sign of Wendigo disorder, resumption of conventional eating habits together with a willingness to confess to the details of the tragedy would prefigure readmission. Conversely, concealment and anorexia would provoke fear and scrutiny or ostracism. Explicit antisocial behavior, such as threats, might provoke a definition of the sufferers as a Wendigo, leading to attempts at cure or to execution. Since suspicion and ostracism would in some contexts exacerbate psychological trauma produced by the tragedy, survivors of famine cannibalism incidents sometimes provoked their executions through inability to communicate a condition of normalcy to their accusers. So Brightman reports that there are a few factors that influence the conclusion to a potential Wendigo story: to be ostracized, killed, or readmitted into society. A good amount of this decision seems to be weighed on their behavior after the incident. For example, as we mentioned before, it's frequently seen in Wendigo belief that a Wendigo will forego standard food for desire of human flesh. After the circumstances of famine have passed, if the person is willing to and resumes conventional eating habits, that's a step in the right direction. If they're also willing to take accountability for their actions, as difficult as recounting this horrible event would be, that's another step in the right direction. The person has to be open about what's transpired, for if they continue to withhold information or refuse food, this would spark further scrutiny and suspicion. After all, other people's lives were possibly on the line. While the tribe's caution is understandable, this suspicion and the ostracism that followed may have made the psychological trauma worse. This would make reassimilating difficult, as their guilt or forgiveness seemed dependent on being able to quickly revert to a, quote, normal state of being. However, if the circumstances were found to be done to survive, and the person had taken the right steps to be honest with the community, many communities would show a tremendous amount of compassion. The 1981 study Windigo accounts from the James Bay Cree reads, quote, "Informants did not blame Windigos for unexplained disappearances of hunters or others. but most often attributed their disappearances to starvation or accidents while on the hunt. The lone adult survivor of a group that had starved was usually viewed with suspicion, but evidence was sought to determine whether or not cannibalism had taken place. Many instances of starvation cannibalism were recognized as one-time events with no subsequent effects on the individual's behavior. Finally, none of the narratives given to us includes an element of group contagion. If the situation was deemed as that of a Wendigo, DeSanti notes that Ojibwe communities did everything they could to help them. Extensive attempts were made to heal who they believed to be an infected person. Fur trapper George Nelson wrote, quote, "They are in general kind and extremely indulgent to those thus infected. They seem to consider it an infliction and are desirous of doing all they can to assist. There are, however, many exceptions, but these depend on the circumstances attending them." Brightman notes, quote, that persons who had killed and eaten their children in food crises were given other children to adopt. A man named Thompson recorded a case amongst the Manitoba Cree where a man wasn't condemned or ostracized after he'd killed his youngest child in order to feed the rest of the family. Because famine cannibalism was such a high potential risk, West Main Swampy Cree groups viewed incidents of starvation cannibalism as tragic one-time events with no following consequences to the individual. Indeed, we saw this echoed in a few of the Windigo narratives that these tribe members grew up with. It was only as a last resort that they would terminate a Wendigo. From all of these reports, it stands to show that these communities, within reason, recognized famine cannibalism as a horrific, traumatic event in this person's life that now deserved compassion. You were not inherently a monster for having to survive these conditions. With how popular the Wendigo has become in the internet zeitgeist, it's important to emphasize that despite the harsh conditions, incidents of cannibalism weren't a frequent occurrence. Sure, they were a constant threat, but actually succumbing to it was not frequent. Even a good number of Euro-Canadian observers would speak of these incidents in Algonquian tribes, not as an example of savagery, but as a tragedy. One of these such observers writes, quote, "Hunger will induce any man to do an inhuman action." Graham in 1969 wrote, quote, "It must be owned that they go through incredible hardships before they have recourse to this dreadful expedient." When it comes to a more modern viewpoint of the Wendigo in Native society, I've seen completely opposite reports. DeSanti writes that, quote, "Many contemporary Ojibwe communities accept the Wendigo as a real entity that exists alongside countless Manitos, or spiritual beings, of varying degrees of power and disposition that permeate their experience of the world." On the other side of the coin, Nathan Carlson writes in his paper Reviving Wetiko that, quote, "While many local people still believe in the Wetiko, the belief complex as a whole was only collectively ascribed to prior to the 21st century. So it seems dependent on the community, and even down to the individual, whether or not they believe the Wendigo exists in the present day. Maybe it's just evolved, or been changed by the passing of time, but that'll be a topic for next time. Pop back in next week as we pick back up with the changing times. This started when the settlers came into the picture and began to record these Wendigo incidents, as well as how they, themselves, related to this monster. We'll also take a look at several legal cases throughout the centuries. All of that and more next week.